Now in this order service microservice, I'm going to create the status entity first. And Git is asking whether we need to add the file to Git. So I will cancel it for now. Maybe I will do it later manually. In the status entity, we have to have the status ID and status as the fields. I will annotate it with at entity annotation, and also I will add the Lombok annotations. And at table annotation, I can use to give the name of the table in the database. And I'm going to use the at ID annotation and at generated value annotation so that whenever a record is created in the database, ID will be assigned automatically. And the column name I can give status underscore ID, similar to what we have mentioned in the ER diagram. And the next column I can give the column name as status. So I'm done with the entity. Now I'm going to create the status repository. So Git is again asking to add this to Git. So I will check the box and hit cancel. And this status repository is going to extend the JPA repository. And in the generic, I will give the two parameters as status as the first parameter and the integer as the second parameter, because we have the status ID as an integer in our status entity. Next, I'm going to create the DTO, status DTO class. We can use the same fields as our entity. And I'm going to annotate the DTO class with the Lombok annotations. As the next step, I'm going to create the status service. Status service should be an interface, and in the interface, I'm going to define all the methods that controller is going to call in the status service. So the first method is create status, which takes a parameter of status DTO, and then it will return a object of status DTO. Next method I'm going to define is get all status. So it will return a list of status DTO objects, and it will not take any parameters. The third method is get status by ID, which takes a parameter of integer, which is the status ID, and it will return an object of status DTO. Next, I'm going to define the update status method. This method will take the first parameter as the status DTO object as the first parameter, and the second parameter as status ID, which is of type integer, and this method will return an object of type status DTO. Finally, the delete status method, it will not return anything, so we will use the void as the return type, and it will take a parameter of type integer, and the parameter name is status ID. So once the status service is complete, we can go ahead and create another package inside the service package called IMPL. And in the IMPL package, I'm going to create the status service IMPL class, which implements the status service interface. We can hover and then we can click the implement methods to simply implement the methods. And I can annotate this class with @service annotation, and also I can add the @all_args constructor annotation as well. Now the next step is to add the model mapper dependency to our project. Similarly, similar to what we did in the customer service project, I'm going to copy the dependency from the pom.xml of the customer service project, and I'm going to add the dependency to the pom.xml of the order service project. We can click the load Maven changes. Once that's done, I can go ahead and define the model mapper bean inside the order service application. Now we can inject the model mapper into our service status service IMPL class. First, I'm going to inject the status repository, which we need to use inside the status service IMPL class. And next, I'm going to inject the model mapper instance as well. So inside the create status method, we need to first convert the status DTO object into an object of status type. So for that, I'm going to use the model mapper. And then we can call the save method of the status repository by passing the status object, and that will return the saved status, and we can get that saved status into the saved status variable. Then again, we can use the model mapper to map the saved status object back to a status DTO object, and then we can return it. The next method is getAllStatus method. Here we can call the findAll method of the status repository, and that will return a list of status objects, but we will have to map that list into a list of status DTO objects. So I'm going to use the stream and then the map method, and inside the map method I'm going to call the model mapper, and by passing the status object to the model mapper, we can convert each status object into a status DTO object. Then we can use the collect method to convert it to a list of status DTO objects. Next method is getStatusById method. Here we have to call the findById method of the status repository, and we need to pass the status ID, and this will return an optional of status. So we have to use the or else throw method, and in case if there is if it did not return any valid status object, we can return exception of resource not found type, which has not yet created. I will create it shortly. So for now I'm going to use that resource not found exception, and I'm going to pass a message like this: status with ID does not exist. That will return if there is no valid status found with that status ID. But if it finds a status with that status ID, it will return that status. So I'm going to take it into the found status variable. So I'm going to create a new package called exception, and inside this exception package, I'm going to create the resource not found exception. This resource not found exception class will extend the runtime exception class. And inside the constructor of the resource not found exception, I'm going to call the constructor of the superclass by passing the message. Now we can import this class in our status service IMPL class. Once we get the status object, then we can convert that status object into a status DTO object using the model mapper, and then we can return that. In the next method, we can again call the findById method of status repository. First, to find whether is there a status with this ID exist in our database. We can again use this or else throw method just like before. And in case if there is no status with that ID, we can simply return the resource not found exception. But if there is a status, we can take it into the found status variable. And after that, we can set the values of this found status object, the status value of this found status object to the status value of the status DTO object. And after that, we can call the save method of the status repository, and we can pass the found status object to update the status. Once it's updated in the database, we can get the updated status back into our uh, updated status variable. Then we can use the model mapper to convert the update status object to status DTO object. Then we can return the converted object. Finally, in the delete status method, again we can call the find by ID method of the status repository to get a status object which has the status ID that we are passing to the method. And if there is no status with that ID, we can simply return the resource not found exception as before. And in the next line, we can call the delete by ID method of the status repository by passing the status ID, and it will delete the status with that status ID. So we are done with the status service, and we are going to do the controller layer now. First, let's create the status controller, and we need to annotate that status controller with all args constructor, the Lombok annotation, and also we need to annotate it with the address controller annotation, and also the at request mapping annotation, and we can provide the base URL. We can follow the same structure as before. Inside the status controller, first we can create the create status endpoint, which will return a response entity object with the status DTO object. And the create status object will take a parameter of status DTO. We need to annotate this endpoint with at post mapping annotation, and also at request body annotation is required to convert the JSON into a status DTO object. I'm going to inject the status service into the status controller, and then inside the create status method, I'm going to call the create status method of the status service. We need to pass the status DTO object into the create status method, and it will return an object of status DTO. Then we can return a new response entity with the saved status object and also the HTTP status of created. Create status endpoint is completed. Now I'm going to work on the next endpoint, which is get all status. This endpoint returns a list of status DTO objects in the response entity, and it does not take any parameters. We have to call the get all status method of the status service. Once it returns the list of status DTO objects, we can return the response entity with that returned list and the status HTTP status of OK. And also we have to annotate this method with at getMapping annotation. The next endpoint is get status by ID. So this will again return object of response entity with status DTO object, and it needs a parameter of integer, which is the status ID. We need to annotate this with at getMapping annotation, and also we have to provide a path variable here, and also at path variable annotation is required to bind the path variable to the status ID parameter. Next, we are calling the get status by ID method of the status service, and we are passing the status ID value. It's going to return a status DTO object if there is a status with that status ID. Then we can return that found status inside the response entity along with the HTTP status of OK. Next endpoint is update status endpoint. So this will again return an object of response entity, and it will contain an object of status DTO. And this method takes two parameters. One is the status DTO object, and other parameter is status ID of type integer. We have to annotate this method with at putMapping annotation. Also, we have to pass a path variable here, and we can use the request body annotation as before to convert the JSON to the status DTO object, and also at path variable annotation to bind the path variable to the status ID parameter. Then we are going to call the update status method of the status service, and we can pass status DTO and the status ID as the two parameters, and it will return a object of status DTO if there is a if it able to update the status successfully. Then we can return that updated status with status code of OK. In the final endpoint, we can again return a response entity, and this time it will return simply a string message to indicate whether the delete was successful or not, and it will take one parameter of type integer, which is the status ID, and delete status method of the status service is going to call here with the parameter of status ID. Finally, response entity is being returned with a message indicating the status with the ID was deleted successfully. Also, we have to return the HTTP status of OK, and we need to annotate this method with at delete mapping annotation, and we have to specify the path variable as well. Okay, uh, we have completed the controller layer as well, and all done for this.